Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this webinar, Considerations for Underserved Commercial Buildings. I'm Carolyn Tolentino. I use she, her, ella pronouns. I'm a research analyst at the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, or ACEEE, and I am based in the Piscataway and Naquachtek lands, otherwise known as Washington, D.C. So before starting off with some housekeeping announcements, I'll turn it off to Ana Vidales, our interpreter, to explain how you can access simultaneous Spanish interpretation during today's webinar.
Thank you so much. Buenas tardes o buenos días, donde se encuentren. Yo soy Ana Vidales y voy a ser su intérprete esta tarde. Si ustedes gustan escuchar esta presentación en español, tienen que irse aquí que dice interpretación, eligen español, también tienen la opción de silenciar el audio original para solo escuchar al intérprete. Si lo dejan abierto, escucharán al intérprete a un 80% y al ponente principal a un 20%. Si ustedes se están uniendo con nosotros por medio de un teléfono o un iPad, entonces tiene que irse a los 3 puntitos que dicen More, elige Language Interpretation y después elige Español y Done. Lo de silenciar el audio original también aplica al iPad y al teléfono. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you. I'm ready.
Thank you, Ana. And now for some housekeeping announcements. We are recording this webinar, and we will be making the recording available to all registrants within a few business days. To ask a question during the webinar, please submit it via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can also upvote questions in the Q&A box that you would like us to prioritize. You can use the chat to engage in respectful and productive discussion with other participants. Just as a note, R2E2 will not tolerate behaviors that cause harm or disrupt the learning environment. Please direct message Krista Lee if you feel unsafe. Disruptive participants may be removed from the webinar. So by participating, you are agreeing to uphold a culture of respect and contribute to a productive learning environment for everyone. Okay, and now I'd like to introduce Megan Plock from the U.S. Department of Energy's Building Technologies Office to provide an overview of the Buildings Upgrade Prize before we dive into today's training webinar content. Megan?
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you all for taking time to be here today. The Buildings Upgrade Prize, or Buildings Up, is designed to rapidly scale energy efficiency and efficient electrification upgrades to existing buildings all across the country. This is not a prize to upgrade a single building, but rather to develop an initiative that will complete many building upgrades in your building upgrade zone. The prize is envisioned to consist of 4 phases over approximately 5 years, subject to approvals and availability of funds, but we are currently in phase 1, or the concept phase of this prize, which will award over $22 million in cash prizes and technical assistance to teams. Applications for phase 1 close on July 18th of this year. We're seeking about 20 to 60 winning teams to join the Buildings Up co-opetition, and we call it a co-opetition rather than a competition because we're not looking to crown a single winning team at the end. Instead, we hope to see as many teams as possible move through the prize phases successfully. To address this challenge, we'll need all hands on deck, working together and sharing our best ideas with one another to move farther, faster. So the goals for Buildings Up, we aim to address the persistent administrative, financial, social, and other barriers to energy efficiency and reducing on-site emissions from existing buildings. We have the technologies that are available for us to get there, like heat pumps and heat pump water heaters, but we need to make these technologies more accessible. Only about 1 to 2% of buildings in the country are retrofitted for energy upgrades each year, which just isn't fast enough. We need innovations to address the non-technical barriers, the persistent financial, administrative, social, and other barriers to improving our buildings. So Buildings Up is a capacity building prize that will support teams to develop solutions that accelerate building upgrades beyond current best practices, are importantly scalable and replicable, and are built to last beyond the period of the prize. Buildings Up also seeks to benefit underserved communities by ensuring that at least 40% of prize benefits accrue to equity eligible buildings, their occupants, and the surrounding community. So our pathways and prizes for Buildings Up. We ask our applicants to select one of two pathways. The equity-centered innovation pathway will award $400,000 in cash prizes for each winning team. And the open innovation pathway will award $200,000 in prizes for each winning team. For equity-centered, we ask that teams commit at least 80% of their building upgrade initiative implementation on equity eligible buildings, which I will get into in the next slide. And for the open innovation pathway, applicants are not required to focus on these equity eligible buildings, but they may if they wish to. And technical assistance to concept submissions. So turning your concept submissions into implementation plans will be provided to all winning teams from both pathways. So for the purpose of this prize, equity eligible.
Oops, apologies, everyone. It looks like we've got a little tech trouble on Megan's end, but I can pick up where she left off. I know she's traveling and probably having a little bit of trouble accessing the internet wherever she is, but hopefully she can jump back on. Thanks for the patience. So for the purposes of this prize, the following building types are considered equity eligible buildings and are defined in 4 categories to meet the requirements of the equity-centered innovation pathway: geographic location, affordable housing and housing occupied by low-income residents, underserved commercial, nonprofit, and public buildings, which will be the focus of today's training webinar, and we'll go into much more depth about this later on. And there's a 4th team-defined category. We recognize that there may be specific local conditions or considerations that could make buildings equity eligible, such as areas with job loss due to energy transitions, weather emergencies, linguistic isolation, etc. So applicants can also create a local definition of equity eligible buildings and submit for consideration by the prize team. Here are some example initiative types that also show building upgrade zones. One example in the upper left-hand corner, a rural electric cooperative partners with a local community-based organization and the county to help low to moderate income single-family home residents transition from propane heat to efficient electric heat pumps. In this example, the building upgrade zone would be low and moderate income or LMI single-family homes currently using propane within an entire utility service area. And again, Buildings Up is designed to support innovations addressing non-technical barriers to scaling and replicating these kinds of programs. And some of those non-technical barriers include lack of contractor and occupant familiarity with technologies, high first cost for upgrades, lack of retrofit materials and equipment because of supply chain issues or disruptions, and insufficient local workforce to complete the upgrades, lack of reach of funding and incentive programs, or inconsistent quality of work or consumer mistrust behind retrofit programs and projects. So some next steps for those who are interested in applying, we recommend that first you start off by following the prize on herox.com/buildingsup. Read the prize rules that are located on the website and review the frequently asked questions document that we keep up to date there with all of the questions that we're getting at the email inbox that you see at the bottom of this screen. We've got an informational webinar coming up on May 4th at 11 a.m. Eastern that will go in depth about all of the prize logistics, timeline, application process, etc. And if you're ready to get rolling on your application, after you create your HeroX account, you can click the Solve This Challenge button to start working on your concept plan and make sure to get that submitted before the applications close on July 18th. Thanks, and I'll turn it back over to you, Carolyn.
Thanks, Carolyn, for finishing up that section. Now we're going to move forward with the main content of the webinar. I will be one of the presenters. As I mentioned, I'm Carolyn Tolentino, research analyst at ACEEE, and I am joined today by Carolyn Conant, whom you just heard from, technical assistance coordinator at ACEEE, and Amber Wood, buildings program director, also at ACEEE. The Residential Retrofits for Energy Equity, or R2E2 for short, is a new nationwide initiative that provides training to state, local, and tribal governments, as well as community-based organizations and other partners to jumpstart energy efficiency upgrades for affordable housing that will lower utility bills, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, improve residents' health, create good-paying local jobs, and help advance racial equity. R2E2 is supported by supporting the building's upgrade prize by providing training and technical assistance to applicants and awardees. By the end of the session, you will have a deeper understanding of underserved commercial buildings, including why they're a priority building category for upgrades, the types of buildings and locations that can be considered underserved commercial, barriers to these upgrades and potential solutions. And you'll also be able to begin crafting a locally appropriate definition of underserved commercial for your community. Lastly, we'll learn from case studies how local jurisdictions are providing support to underserved commercial buildings through their own programs. And note that we use the terms retrofits and upgrades interchangeably for this presentation. Different resources use them in different contexts, but we will use them interchangeably, just so you know. Just to go over briefly the scoring criteria. So for the building's upgrade prize, teams will submit applications composed of narratives about their concept plans. They are going to be scored based on how strongly reviewers agree with scoring statements. And so the relevant scoring statements to this training are criteria 1, assessing and prioritizing challenges, 2, addressing challenges through innovation, and 5, achieving equitable building upgrade strategies. Now, some examples of specific areas of evaluation under these criteria include 1, the team has a clearly defined building upgrade zone and demonstrates an understanding of the buildings to be addressed within it. Another example is the proposed building upgrade strategies will deliver substantial benefits to residents or occupants. And another example, the team includes CBOs or other organizations that can represent the equity eligible building occupants in the building upgrade zone. Just kind of to go through the agenda, this will follow very closely those learning goals that I outlined at the beginning. So what underserved commercial buildings are, why we need to prioritize them, the eligibility criteria for the building's upgrade prize, understanding underserved commercial in the context of local communities, of each local community. And the last thing we'll cover in the presentation will be case studies, and then we will follow that with Q&A. Great, so we'll start with a quick poll. Nick, if you could please start that up. We'd like to learn more about you, our audience. So please answer what sector best describes your organization. The poll should be up on your screen now, and I'll give everyone a few seconds to answer that. And also the second question at the same time will be, what buildings are the focus of your programs and policies? So those 2 questions should be up on your screen now. I'll give a couple more seconds to make that choice. And now we'll share the results. Okay. Great, pretty good variety we see here. Awesome, thank you for participating in that. Now we are going to move on to the rest of the presentation. So we're going to start with this question: what are underserved commercial buildings? And to answer that, we'll start with the people, right? So underserved people include Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, also known as BIPOC communities, low-income communities, frontline communities, environmental justice communities, and other historically excluded and or systematically excluded groups. So a lot of different communities, they have different markers and different causes for the name and for what makes them so. Systematically marginalized communities are those that are most impacted by community decision-making while not being involved in those decisions at all. Under-resourced communities have high proportions of low and middle income residents and receive below average quality and amount of services and financial resources, both from the government and from the private sector. And frontline communities are those most impacted by multiple and cumulative real sources of pollution and climate impacts due to proximity to factories, highways, fossil fuel refineries, and so on and so forth. So very broadly, we use underserved commercial to describe the commercial, nonprofit, and public buildings that serve the people in these aforementioned communities. We'll revisit the same slide later and go through specific examples and caveats, so I won't spend too much time on it. But in general, these kind of buildings include schools, and these underserved communities, small disadvantaged businesses, community centers, among others. And now we'd like to hear from you again. So we have another poll. We'd like to learn about what terms you use to refer to this kind of work, whether it's underserved commercial, under-resourced, or something not included on here. And if it's something else, please let us know the term that you use in the chat. Again, we'll give a couple of seconds for the answers to come in, and we'll share the results. Okay. Interesting. Well, that's really good to know. We know that these terms are different community to community and area of the country, area by area. So it's good to hear what is being used on the ground. Okay, so why the focus on underserved commercial? To answer that, I'll take a step back and say that we think it's very important. ACEEE thinks it's very important through our work to think through how we can center equity in the energy system. So ACEEE launched its Leading with Equity initiative recently to ensure that our work isn't just evaluating energy efficiency actions, but also whether those actions are equitable from their development to their outcomes. And this is how we think about achieving equity broad and systematically across different areas, right? We want to make sure that we keep all these types of equity in mind: structural, procedural, distributional, transgenerational. To dig a little deeper into that, this is how we think of the different pieces that make an equitable energy system. So it's the circular, ongoing process of achieving fair distribution, considering intergenerational impacts, ensuring representation, power, and influence from community members during the decision-making process, institutionalizing accountability, embedding inclusive, accessible, and authentic community engagement, and recognizing, that's sort of been the first step, recognizing and addressing those historical, cultural, institutional dynamics. And we emphasize this is a circular process, again, because it is never ending. It's not you do it once and then it's over. It's always evolving, right? Now, going back to buildings, ACEEE released the Halfway There report in 2019 that predicts that energy efficiency measures alone could reduce energy use and emissions by half by 2050. And if you look at the measures that are related to buildings, buildings have the potential to deliver 40% of those energy savings and 33% of those emissions reductions. Which buildings? Well, new construction is going to make up an increasingly larger part of total buildings. And of course, we must ensure that that is as efficient as possible. But the reality is that existing buildings, represented here by the blue area, will remain the great majority of our building stock as far out as 2050 and beyond. So in order to meet our decarbonization goals, it is crucial that we decarbonize our existing buildings. And this is why Buildings Up was created, to address this massive opportunity in existing buildings. So we know that energy efficiency has numerous benefits, and we can ensure that those benefits extend beyond business as usual and actually reach the communities that need it most, right? So tying these two things together, decarbonization and equity, together, these can have a number of significant benefits in underserved communities. There's a lot of examples on this slide: increasing affordability, improving health, comfort, and safety, increasing climate resilience, especially important in these communities, frontline communities that are more exposed to extreme weather, or that are exposed to extreme weather more frequently and in more impactful ways, etc. Now, because commercial buildings deliver essential services to the communities they're in order to ensure that these underserved communities thrive and benefit from decarbonization, we have to pay special attention to underserved commercial. So with that, I'll pass it off to Carolyn, who will revisit what comprises an underserved commercial building.
Thanks, Carolyn. Hello again, everyone. My name is also Carolyn Conant, and I'm the Technical Assistance Coordinator for R2E2 at ACEEE. Now that we've covered some of the key opportunities that come from focusing on upgrades for underserved commercial buildings, I'll revisit what qualifies as an underserved or equity eligible commercial building within the scope of the Buildings Upgrade Prize. The underserved commercial sector includes many organizations and building types that provide vital services to communities and can experience high energy and building maintenance costs. These high costs can inhibit wealth building and economic development on the commercial side and direct crucial resources away from services to the community on the nonprofit side. One option in the Buildings Upgrade Prize for identifying equity eligible commercial buildings to meet the criteria of the equity-centered innovation pathway is using federal mapping tools that designate disadvantaged areas. The Climate and Environmental Justice Screening Tool and DOE-designated Justice 40 census tracts can both be used to identify geographic areas with equity-eligible buildings. The links to these two mapping tools are included on the resources slide at the end of this presentation, and you can join us at our follow-up office hours sessions for more assistance with learning how to use these different tools. All federally recognized tribal lands and U.S. territories are automatically included in geographic designations for disadvantaged areas. A second option for teams to identify equity-eligible commercial buildings is using the definitions outlined in section 3.5 on pages 17 to 18 of the official prize rules. The building types listed on this slide provide a framework for possible types of commercial buildings that could fit within the equity-eligible buildings category as outlined in the rules, and include small disadvantaged businesses and businesses serving disadvantaged communities, Title I schools or schools with high percentages of students qualifying for free and reduced cost lunch, buildings used by nonprofit organizations or that shelter critical community services, including buildings that serve as resilience hubs, disaster shelters, or emergency shelters, and other commercial or nonprofit buildings defined as equity eligible through community input. Whoops. Sorry about that. Tiny arrows. So DOE recognizes that community-based organizations, local governments, community leaders, and other local stakeholders have on-the-ground knowledge of underserved communities in their local context, not necessarily captured by the national data sets that are used in the geographic mapping tools we just looked at, or the categories provided on the previous slide. So for the Buildings Upgrade Prize, a third option for identifying equity-eligible underserved commercial buildings is to propose a locally specific definition of equity-eligible buildings in your community. Some options for additional variables to consider when crafting your own local definition include low income, high poverty or high unemployment rates, racial and ethnic segregation or linguistic isolation, areas with high housing cost burden, transportation cost burden, or energy burden, disproportionate exposure to environmental burdens like industrial pollution or impacts from climate change like coastal flooding, or limited water, sanitation, or healthcare access and affordability. Clearly, there's massive variety in the types of buildings, neighborhoods, and communities that are encompassed by these definitions, which is great because it gives you a lot to work with and a lot of opportunities to bring benefits to your communities. To better understand how communities can address energy efficiency upgrades across these very different types of underserved commercial buildings, R2E2 held 14 interviews with community-based organizations, jurisdictions, utilities, and nonprofits about their programs that have focused on this segment of buildings and communities. Despite the variety in building types served by different energy efficiency programs focusing on underserved commercial entities, we heard common themes in terms of motivation for scaling upgrades. These motivations included aligning energy and climate goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions community-wide, while simultaneously addressing energy burden and promoting energy equity across communities, improving indoor air quality by removing indoor air pollutants, and enhancing the resilience of buildings and communities, while also working to promote job creation, economic development, social equity, and wealth building, and advancing pathways to economic prosperity. Working with a specific focus on underserved commercial also helps different program managers better serve communities. And we also heard it's just the right thing to do. We also heard about common obstacles to scaling upgrades in underserved commercial buildings like small businesses, buildings housing nonprofits, and minority-owned businesses. Financing is a big one, including upfront costs, lack of access to capital, or lack of sustainable or long-term funding, as well as making the business case to building owners and occupants for why they should go through all the trouble of pursuing energy efficiency upgrades. Relationships or a lack of existing relationships is a big impediment as well. And this can also include mistrust of utility or other program managers and a suspicion of hidden costs that could accompany free services. There are a lot of workforce barriers that factor into difficulty serving underserved commercial buildings, an insufficient contractor or energy advisor workforce, lack of sufficiently technically skilled workforce, or a workforce that's not reflective of the communities being served, all create barriers. For knowledge, awareness, and education, there's often a lack of awareness or expertise in building owners and occupants of the opportunities associated with energy efficiency upgrades, why they're important and can make a difference, what to do to pursue energy efficiency upgrades, or how to prioritize where to start and what measures to begin with. Time and capacity was another major obstacle. Lack of dedicated staff or insufficient staff capacity, lack of time or complications caused by long project timelines, and outreach and engagement remains a persistent obstacle. Many program implementers are unsure how to tailor outreach and engagement strategies for existing energy efficiency programs to better reach underserved communities. In addition to hearing about common barriers to scaling up upgrades for underserved commercial buildings, we also identified common gaps in program models and ways they fall short in their service offerings for this sector specifically. One common gap was not going far enough, having offerings that are limited to education, a free energy assessment, or direct install measures that are not enough to achieve meaningful savings for building occupants or owners. Insufficient financing and rebates is another common gap. For example, DIY or do-it-yourself measures undertaken by small businesses are often ineligible for rebates, and many programs face a lack of sufficient long-term dedicated funding to make them sustainable beyond the lifespan of a grant or another finite funding source. A lack of culturally appropriate service models and community outreach and engagement tactics is also common. And this can include insufficient program offerings to support the specific needs of sectors like nonprofits, schools, or houses of worship that are different from typical single-family energy efficiency retrofit programs. Lack of data, another big one. Data to identify underserved commercial buildings, to indicate community-specific needs, to be able to design programs to be responsive to those needs, and insufficient data to track follow through with upgrades and actually be able to calculate energy savings to share about the benefits of upgrades with other potential program participants. And a lack of alignment between city and utility goals, strategies, and service offerings. This leaves it up to entities or individuals who are seeking upgrades to navigate multiple, complicated, and sometimes contradictory offerings. And initiatives can also be inhibited by restrictive or unsupportive local or state policy and regulatory environments. While there's unfortunately no one-size-fits-all solution for these many obstacles, we did hear some common themes across existing initiatives for how to tackle some of these challenges. One option is providing in-depth support, so making sure to include one-on-one advising and a focus on long-term relationship building with building owners and occupants pursuing upgrades, as well as ongoing education about opportunities for improvements. This also includes assistance, deep one-on-one assistance navigating multiple program offerings, rebates, and incentives to try to streamline those different offerings. Having a plan for innovative financing makes a big difference as well, reducing upfront costs and overall costs to building owners and occupants to the greatest extent possible, potentially offering unsecured, low or no cost loans to assist with financing, or considering braided funding opportunities to fill in those financing gaps and be able to reduce the overall cost. Reducing the burden of participating is a huge solution that can address many of the issues we looked at earlier. This includes making all materials accessible to a broad audience, so avoiding jargon and technical language and providing materials in languages other than English, and ensuring easy access to information, including translation and interpretation services. Potentially providing assistance with grant writing and accessing funding can also really reduce the burden of participating in upgrade measures, and ensure trainings and technical assistance offerings are responsive to people's work schedule constraints. How can a small business step away in the middle of the day to go to a training about how to prioritize energy efficiency measures in their business? And tap into existing community infrastructure to give people the information that they need in a setting that's convenient to them. Ensure broad stakeholder involvement. Successful initiatives will take a broad approach to improving building efficiency and should include involvement from stakeholders from community-based organizations, different levels of government, project implementers like weatherization and electrification contractors, and any others who are crucial to meeting the different priorities that you're embedding in your program model. Finally, involve the community directly in initiative design. Initiatives will not be successful if they're not designed to meet the self-identified needs and priorities of the groups that you're looking to serve and engage with. Across the board, what we heard most in these interviews with underserved commercial program implementers was how crucial it is to involve input from communities in the design and implementation of services. Specific lessons learned and advice included: go to communities and listen rather than expecting communities to come to you. Foster trusted relationships, which is a long-term ongoing process. Be okay with not being the expert and bring in the people or groups with the appropriate on-the-ground expertise for the communities you're working with, and ensure both transparency and accountability to feedback received from community input at every stage of the process. And now we'll go through some examples of energy efficiency and electrification initiatives that have been crafted to address considerations specific to working in underserved commercial buildings. So I'll invite on my colleague Amber to take us through those case studies.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. So I am excited to be able to present a few case studies to you of successful programs that are addressing underserved commercial. So the first one I'd like to talk about is going to be the Neighborhood Power Project. So this is in Chicago, Illinois, and the Illinois Green Alliance, in partnership with Elevate and the Environmental Defense Fund, EDF, is bringing high-performance upgrades to often overlooked buildings. The project helps reduce the energy burden on nonprofits, empowers organizations to serve as a resource for their constituents, and demonstrates the value in delivering climate action to every community. So how do they do this, you might ask? So they do this through a couple things. The program provides both consulting services and financial support for upgrades. As of today, there's 15 community-centered organizations that span 11 Chicago neighborhoods that have enrolled in the Neighborhood Power Project. So while I say this is a single case study, it's actually, there's 15, I think a total of 15 case studies on the website that you can actually go through. And I'm showing one titled Family Matters on the right-hand side of the page. But if you take the link at the bottom to the Neighborhood Power Project, there's one-pagers on each of the projects. And they go through and detail each participant, the energy upgrades for that specific project, and the cost savings that happened, as well as the story about them, because I think that's really important as part of considering case studies. So that's the Neighborhood Power Project. The next one I'm going to go through is Boulder County PACE. So this is in Colorado. Boulder County's Partner for a Clean Environment PACE program they've had offerings for 30 years, but they redesigned their program about 5 years ago to specifically focus on underserved, hard to reach businesses. They developed a locally specific definition of underserved commercial, including a process where businesses can make the case for their eligibility. They incorporated racial equity by gathering data that showed that most minority-owned small businesses were restaurants. And then they tailored their program to achieve energy-efficient upgrades in those restaurants by specifically an additional refrigeration and restaurant equipment grant offering. As part of this, they hired Spanish-speaking staff and made all materials and services available in Spanish. The program covers 70% of the project cost upfront, but they also found that one of the challenges was actually just managing the logistics of the upgrades. So they actually, the PACE program themselves, now coordinate with contractors to take the burden off the business owners. So they provide extensive one-on-one technical assistance and hand-holding for small business owners. Two keys to their success were the fact that they partner with the Latino Chamber of Commerce for community engagement and outreach, and that also they partner with their utility on additional energy efficient pilot programs, such as swapping out fluorescents. And then the last case study that I get to go through, and actually shout out to those on the call. I think we have some people here that have more expertise in this than I, but I will present this and then happy to hear from you all in either the chat and or with any of the questions they can help too. So the City and County of Denver is the last case study that we're putting together. So as part of their Energized Denver ordinance, which is Denver's benchmarking and building performance standard to enhance existing commercial buildings, they wanted to determine how to support underserved buildings, which they call equity priority buildings. As part of this, they developed a locally specific definition of underserved commercial, as I mentioned before, that are called equity priority. And these buildings serve frontline communities with less access to resources who may face more barriers adapting to a changing climate. As part of this, they developed criteria for compliance assistance for the Energized Denver performance policy, including developing a building energy equity score. They provide additional support and resources in the form of long-term free compliance assistance and meeting Energized Denver performance requirements beyond what the Energized Denver Help Desk or Hub typically provides. They've also ensured that the Hub provides multilingual support. Of note, one of the keys to Denver's success is that they hired an equity administrator to support all their work in the Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency. So a few examples of what's happening in this world of underserved commercial buildings. So a few lessons learned. So these are lessons learned based on the case studies and interviews to really scale underserved commercial building upgrades. It includes the following things on this page. So this is very detailed. I'm going to highlight just a couple of them. We've talked about engaging with the community and collaborations among stakeholders to meet community goals. I would just like to emphasize that it's also really important to ensure that listening to communities builds trust and leads to incorporating this input and to actionable steps. So to go back to what Carolyn T was talking about at the beginning, the intent is that this is a circular process and not just a single one-time event. And so I will move to the learning goals and takeaways here. So as mentioned before, these were the learning goals, but we hope that some of them are actually your takeaways as well. So we hope you take away why certain commercial buildings are underserved, some of the common barriers to pursuing upgrades, as well as potential strategies for overcoming or addressing these barriers. A focus of this webinar is to think about how to craft a locally appropriate definition of underserved commercial and also choose which segments of the building stock and or community to target to maximize benefits of energy efficiency in your community. So we actually do have a concluding poll. What would you like to learn more about? So if you could please run that now, that would be wonderful. And we'll give you a few seconds to answer our couple questions here about what areas you still have the most questions and what would you be interested in exploring in our office hours. We'll give you just a couple more seconds because I know it is kind of two questions in one. And why don't we look at the results now? Great. Well, thank you very much for your results. So still a lot of interest in asking questions and exploring more, which is wonderful. Okay. So a couple future things. We do have further upcoming webinars. Of note, I would like to note that on Friday, we actually do have another training webinar at 1 p.m. The title is Drivers of Energy Efficiency and Affordable Housing. So we would love to have you join us for the next one. And we obviously have further future ones as well. And then we mentioned this, but we actually also have office hours of most interest. And to loop back to our poll question we just had, on Monday, May 15th at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, we actually have office hours to talk about this very topic of considerations for underserved commercial buildings, and would love to have you, while we will do a Q&A session after this, we will have this office hours session to have even more time to answer your questions and have discussions about this topic. And then finally, we do have a number of resources. So we intended to also make this presentation be helpful for you in the future so that you can actually go back and read more about these different pieces that we've done, and also just support some future research if you're interested in doing that. And with that, I just want to thank you all. We have made it through our actual presentation, and I think we have a number of questions, and we are going to go to that now.
Hey everyone, I'm Ian with ACEEE. So we'll be going into the Q&A now. We have some questions that we've answered in the chat and others that we were not able to answer yet in the chat. So we'll go through them one by one. The first two questions are related to the Buildings Up prize. And the first one is, does building ownership matter? Does the size, type of ownership of a building matter?
So in the sense that a team should be working with building owners, yes, building ownership does matter. If you're concerned that the owner of a building may not be an individual from an underserved community, that's okay. We are looking for buildings that serve those underserved communities, essentially. For more information, you can read the rules document on herox.com/buildingsup. And I will also mention that there are two pathways, the open innovation pathway, as well as the equity-centered innovation pathway.
And I have another question for you, Megan, related to the Buildings Up prize. This one is, can other incentive options be stacked with this program?
Yes. So because Buildings Up is a capacity building prize, and only either $200,000 or $400,000 are issued to prize winners, we very much encourage funding braiding. For more information, you can also go to the rules document on herox.com/buildingsup. But also for context, a prize is essentially a cash prize that we ask you to tell us what you will do with those funds, but no monitoring is required on those.
We have another question related to the prize. This one is, does DOE have a geographic limit for defining community, or can it be a portfolio or coalition of folks with common needs or shared strengths?
Great question. So before I accidentally dropped off this call, which I apologize about, I was going over the definitions of equity eligible buildings, and there are 4 different definitions. We have geographic, so in the same area. You could be, so essentially we ask that you define your building upgrade zone and how that satisfies your equity eligible elements. There are more informational training webinars that are listed on the HeroX website, as well as the rules. And I really encourage you to go check those out. So I don't have a straight answer for you. The best answer I can give is that DOE will not be defining your community.
And we've had a few other questions come in about the prize, so we'll get to those before we move on to the other questions. Another question is, can a municipality own a commercial building?
Yes. And one other thing, sorry, that I'd like to raise is that Buildings Up is not focused on one single building. we encourage innovative solutions that approach multiple different buildings and can be scaled across either different areas or building types.
And does this opportunity apply to senior apartment buildings?
Yes.
And we have one more question coming in about the prize. It is, what about commercial buildings being converted to mixed use or residential for equitable housing goals? Would this qualify for the prize?
Yes. Again, as long as it is innovative and scalable and you're looking at more than just one building.
So I think that's all the questions we have about the prize specifically. So we'll move into broader questions about underserved commercial buildings. The first question, which I'll throw to Carolyn, is, are homeless shelters and other shelters of this type considered underserved commercial?
Yes, so emergency shelters, soup kitchens, women's and children's shelters, and other shelters of this type are all considered underserved commercial. And I'll just point people back towards those 4 different definitions that Megan was referencing, where there's really a lot of room in those 4 different categories to make the case for the types of buildings that you want to advocate for as being included in the bucket of underserved commercial to be eligible in your prize concept plan. So when in doubt, I think assume the answer is yes, and it'll just be up to you and your team. If you're not feeling like the building types that you want to propose working on are neatly included in some of the categories laid out in the prize rules, that you can use that 4th option to make the case for why this building type should be considered underserved commercial in your community and worthy of directing these resources towards.
And we have another question coming in. It is, what indicators can we use to identify small disadvantaged businesses?
So a couple of thoughts from me. I think a good starting place, there tends to be a bucket of WMDBE businesses, or women, minority, or disabled or immigrant owned businesses are a good place to start. You can also use geographic location as an indicator. So some of those mapping tools that we suggested at the beginning of the call, if you identify parts of your community or city that are included in federally designated disadvantaged census tracts, any small businesses that fall in those census tracts would automatically be considered disadvantaged or underserved as well. And other indicators, if you don't like the federal mapping tools that you can look at with your more locally based data, could be low income areas, transportation burdened areas, segregated areas, etc. And I think also the case studies and program examples that Amber shared in the presentation include great specific examples of types of indicators that actual communities have used to identify disadvantaged businesses and other underserved commercial entities. I don't know if you wanted to speak to any of those, Amber.
Sure. I think probably the best example of this one is the PACE, Boulder County PACE program did think through that. So there's some additional information on their website about the program and how they thought about that. But I do think that Carolyn was making a good point in that it does depend on how you're focusing it a little bit. And so making sure you think through kind of how you're defining it first, perhaps before then kind of figuring out metrics, is often very helpful, because then I think you can kind of match those two to fit each other.
We have another question related to social equity, and it is, how do we define social equity? I know that's a broad question, but is there anyone that wants to answer that?
So I don't have a specific definition for social equity, but we did just release a memo on our Leading with Equity initiative that has a number of definitions of equity that I think kind of help walk through this a little bit. So without kind of knowing more about the specific question, I mean, I can kind of be direct that we don't just have that, but we do have a number of kind of definitions here. I can put that in the chat, and Carolyn C. may have some additional thoughts on some definition locations, because there are a lot of definitions, and I do think thinking through those intentionally is very important. So.
Yeah, the only additional things I was going to add, Carolyn T beat me to in the chat, but at ACEEE, we tend to focus on energy equity as an energy efficiency nonprofit rather than social equity more broadly. So energy equity just being one component of overall social equity to try to advance equal opportunity, equal access to services, and equal sharing of burdens, whether those be energy costs or pollution from the distribution or generation of energy. So those resources that Carolyn shared in the chat are really great for thinking about energy equity. And I'm sure that there's a lot of folks here on the call who also have great definitions and resources that they could point to for defining social equity. So please feel free to share those in the chat as well.
We have another question about financing. It is, how do you determine when financing versus direct funding is appropriate when serving underserved commercial buildings? And what are some strategies to support commercial building owners who don't have the resources to take on debt?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And I would get back to one of the things that we talked about a lot from the interviews was really talking to the community and listening. So I do think that determining who your community is, defining what that looks like, and then perchance going to that community and understanding what would be most helpful. I do know the city of Portland, Oregon had done a really interesting assessment regarding the idea of EV rebates, electric vehicle rebates, as like a cash for clunkers type thing. They had specifically gone to their community though and asked whether a rebate was really going to work, or whether, especially if they were looking at trying to have an equity side to this, what might work to advance electric vehicles in disadvantaged communities. And they came up with all sorts of really interesting results from that. I can see if I can dig up more information on that specific one, just because I think the program had really thought through the funding side in particular. I know that's not a specific buildings example, but I do think it's a really good example of thinking through the funding itself of direct funds versus how do you really get to the results you're trying to get to. I think those are all really good questions. So hopefully some helpful resources, not a perfect answer though.
And I'll just drop a couple, I'm certainly not a financing expert yet, unfortunately, but we have offered a couple of previous training webinars in this series that were more specifically focused on that topic of how to promote financing options that avoid incurring additional debt for small business owners or tenants or affordable housing owners. So I'll drop the links to those webinar slides and recordings in the chat, and that should have some more specific strategies to help answer that question.
We have another question about the community-led programs that were mentioned, and in general, how we would determine which ones were successful. This attendee is asking, how can we determine when we are successful with a program or not in trying to do this correctly?
Yeah, so the metrics are a really good question as well. We actually have some considerations for metrics that we have done as part of our scorecards. So, and our Leading with Equity initiative. So thinking through metrics for success are extremely important. And then I would say the one thing that we often try to think about is that while it is important to measure metrics for success, it's really important to define, for a lot of instances, what we're really trying to do is make sure that buildings are better for people. And so ensuring and thinking through kind of both the upgrade cost and the operational cost on the affordability side, but also then thinking through what enhanced equity looks like is really important. And some of the metrics might be measurable and some of them might not. So just a few thoughts there. Carolyn may have a few more, but we can also put some resources in the chat for that. So.
We have another question coming in about the prize. If we could return to that briefly. This attendee is asking about upgrading buildings in a school district. They ask what if parts, but not all of the district would meet the underserved building criteria. In that case, would it be better to apply under the open pathway rather than the equity pathway?
Megan, did you want to take that, or I can jump in as well?
Yeah, sorry. Would you mind repeating the question? I'm sorry, things got loud on my end.
No problem. So this attendee is asking about upgrading buildings in a school district, and asking about what if parts, but not all of the district would meet the underserved building criteria. So they're wondering for that scenario, which the better pathway would be for them to apply to.
That's a great question. I mean, it depends on how you define underserved and equity eligible. But I'm not entirely sure based off of that description, which I would choose. So I encourage you to read the rules document on HeroX to get a little bit more information on that, and maybe attend one of our office hours session.
And one thing I was just going to add, for the equity-centered innovation pathway, at least 80% of the benefits of retrofits need to go to disadvantaged communities. So if you are seeing that you're selecting a broad area to look at schools, and some of the schools are Title I or easily qualify as underserved based on the other definitions, but there's some gray area, or you're unable to kind of make the case using your own local definition of underserved commercial for the other schools, that 80% number is kind of the guidelines. So you can include some non-equity eligible specific buildings. It's just that the vast majority of benefits for buildings upgraded in the equity-centered innovation pathway need to go to underserved populations.
Thank you, Carolyn. That's correct.
I think we've gotten to most questions, so we'll just give another minute for folks to add any additional questions that they've had. We have about 2 minutes left, so we can probably get to about one more if any other questions come in. One question came in the chat about how we define an innovative approach. I think that's a very good question. Maybe we can address that, and then we'll have to end it for the day.
Sure. So innovation is something, first we ask that you focus on not just one building, but something that can either be scaled to the national level or beyond your community. We ask that you focus on more than one building, and something that addresses those non-technical barriers that we talked about. So we're not asking for innovation in technology, but innovation in creating access to those technologies. And again, there's a list of minimum technologies in the rules document. But again, something innovative would be scalable and replicable.
All right, everyone. So that takes us to 2:30. Thanks so much for attending, and keep in mind that If you have any additional questions, you can reach out to buildingsup@nrel.gov, which is on the HeroX website. So thanks again and have a great afternoon.